The history of Japan has been documented from the 18th century to the early 20th century. Warships, including 2 steamers of the United States Navy's East India Fleet, led by Matthew Perry, arrived in Japan around 1853. In Japan, this was the first encounter with a white foreigner in the beginning of diplomacy. This was the so-called civilization and enlightenment. At that time, Japan's primitive way of life was replaced by a modernized, westernized, or modernized way of life. Later on, the Japanese began to invade the Korean peninsula and mainland China, where primitive Koreans, like African refugees today, live, according to records. In the early 20th century, the Japanese military became a military power and treated the Koreans like slaves, turning the entire Korean peninsula into a colony-like state. Furthermore, they invaded and occupied the entire northeastern part of China with overwhelming force against the then militarily inadequate Chinese army. In 1935, he was awarded a Manchukuo Emperor's Kinnin-sho. At this time, rather than executing all murderer of the Koreans and Chinese, they were enslaved. In the 1930s, the Japanese army waged a war of aggression further south in mainland China. The Chinese army used all its forces to defend the southern Shanghai area and the capital city of Beijing. The Japanese used ships to wage a war of aggression against Southeast Asian countries as well. At that time, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries were like a group of primitive people, so they could easily occupy their territory without a war. In other words, the Indonesians and others accepted the Japanese military as their friends. To the Japanese, they were treated more like slaves than friends. Rather, it could be rephrased as plundering the British and German colonies without permission. The purpose of the Japanese government was to acquire a military power comparable to the American and Russian armies as a military power, the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The Imperial Republic of Japan. Large amounts of resources and food were incorporated from Southeast Asian countries to Japan by ship. In the 1930s, the United States responded to this invasion by sinking all Japanese transports in submarines. Whether this was a legitimate act or not is not known. The Japanese were not in a position to hold a peace dialogue with the United States to seek justification for these acts of aggression against the United States. The United States was demanding the immediate withdrawal of Japanese troops from China and the countries of Southeast Asia. Under these circumstances, there was no situation in which a proper conversation could be held. Rather, the thought pattern was that the United States would retaliate with a stiff military strike to prevent the United States from attacking Japanese ships. There was no pre-war declaration of war in this war that had been signed by a world treaty. In other words, it was a surprise attack by the Japanese Navy. The first target was the Hawaiian Islands, the closest U.S. territory to Japan. At the time, the United States Pacific Fleet had a staging post in Hawaii. It was the so-called attack on Pearl Harbor. Before the battle, Japan knew from the beginning of the battle that there was an overwhelming difference between Japan and the United States in terms of military strength and material resources. It was difficult for the United States to advance on the mainland because it was located far away from Japan. In the early morning of December 8, 1941, Japanese time, December 7, 1941, Hawaii time, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in the U.S. territory of Hawaii during World War II. There was no turning back and Japan declared war on the United States and Great Britain, beginning the Pacific War. During the war, the slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor," was shouted. In 1942, the Japanese occupied the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines and the Japanese army was able to take the American and Philippine troops who had been taken prisoner. At this time, the Japanese forces took the captured American troops and the American soldier walked about 60 kilometers under the hot sun. Photo on the right. Many died, including 2,300 people. The Japanese surprise attack was successful. As such, communications were made from the aircraft carrier to the Imperial Household Agency by telegraph. On December 8, 1941, a task force consisting of 6 former Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft carriers, about 350 aircraft, and other aircraft attacked the U.S. military base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by surprise. 6 U.S. warships were sunk and approximately 2,400 people were killed. More than 2,400 people were killed or missing, and more than 1,300 were injured. On the Japanese side, the total number of damage was 29 aircraft that did not return and 64 dead. The declaration of war was. On the Japanese side, the total number of damage was 29 aircraft that did not return and 64 dead. The declaration of war was delayed, and some in the U.S. criticized it as a sneak attack. However, it is true. In Japan, it was reported on the radio that the nation had won the war against the United States. The Japanese were all in a celebratory mood. But no one could have predicted at the time that it would later seriously offend the United States.
1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, NBC. Hello, NBC. This is KGU in Honolulu, Hawaii. I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning the distant view, the battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese. The city of Honolulu has also been attacked, and considerable damage done. This battle has been going on for nearly 3 hours. It is no joke, it is a real war. We cannot estimate yet how much damage has been done, but it has been a very severe attack. The Navy and Army appear now to have the air and the sea under control. Just a minute, may I interrupt this just a second, please? This is the telephone company, the chief operator. Yes? We tried to get through on an emergency call. Could you tell me? Well, we're talking to New York now. Please do.
However, no one at the time expected that it would seriously and strongly offend the United States after that attack. Do not wake up a sleeping tiger. Wake not a sleeping lion. Rip up old sores. It is ill to waken sleeping dogs. Let sleeping dogs lie.
American sailors return to battle station. And for our great navy, now facing the long-awaited test in the Pacific, they're ready for action in the fighting tradition of our great navy.